possible. A warm welcome.
Yes, very welcome to Göteborg, Katrin Malabo. We now have two excellent books by Katrin Malabo in Swedish translation. First, Vad ska vi göra med vår hjärna? In French, Que faire de notre cerveau? And in English, What should we do with our brain? Which is a book from 2004. The other book is an essay from 2009, Olyckans ontologi. Katrin Malabo is one of the leading philosophers, currently professor at the philosophy department in Kingston in London, and also at the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of California, Irvine. She has been a visiting professor in several universities, both in the US and in Europe, for example, at Kungliga Konsthögskolan in Stockholm a few years ago. Katrin Malabo is the author to at least 14 books. Many are translated not only into English, but also Japanese, Italian, Spanish, German, and Dutch, and probably many more languages. And luckily now also in Swedish. Central to Malabo's philosophy is the concept of plasticity, something that we will talk about more today. She has worked on and with major philosophers. Her doctoral thesis was under the supervision of Jacques Derrida, and her first book was about Hegel, the future of Hegel, plasticity, temporality, and dialectic. In her What Should We Do with Our Brain, a book that she in her foreword says marks a change in her thinking, she describes a theoretical encounter with neuroscience that from that point expanded and reshaped her research. And her recent books has come to be fascinating and important links between continental philosophy and neuroscience, between symbolic and biological life, between what C.P. Snow famously named the two cultures, humanities and science. In this book, What Should We Do with Our Brain, we can finally hear someone talk about the connection between the brain and social condition, the brain and political engagement, the brain and environment. To quote a line from Emily Dickinson, the brain is wider than the sky. Let's start with the question of plasticity. What is it and why has it such an important role in your work?
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for accepting to conduct this interview with me. It's a great honor, and of course, thank you also to Tankekraft for publishing the books, and to my translators as well. So, plasticity, as you know, it is now a central concept in neurobiology. Neurobiologists talk about the plasticity of the brain, or neuroplasticity, or the plasticity of the connections. And this was, in neurology, introduced as a term against the previous vision of the brain as something fixed, determined, with rigid localization and area of language, area of motricity, etc. Against such a vision, and I'm sure you all know about Pavlov, you know, the dog and the reflexes, etc. Against such a vision, it started, let's say, in the middle of the 20th century. Neurobiologists discovered that, on the contrary, the brain, of course, was for some parts determined and fixed, but also that there was something that they call the global working space. That our brain is a global working space where all the connections are coming together, fire together when we activate them. And this dynamism they called plasticity. They call the plasticity of the brain. Which means that first, once again, the brain is not only a series of fixed localization, but a kind of interaction between these regions. Second, that the connections that are constituting our brains can change. They can change in volume, in size. For example, if you play the piano, the connections activated by the piano playing will grow bigger. On the contrary, if you don't, they will, as they say, depress and become thinner. So our brain is more like a coral that changes during our whole lifetime. So plasticity, as you know, comes from the artistic domain. The plastic in German was the sculpture. So it's because they borrow this term from the artistic domain. They borrowed it because it precisely told, it said something metaphorically about shaping, about fashioning, about something that is not already made but fashions itself through life. So that's why, and I think the first person who discovered this plastic power of the brain was the Spanish neurobiologist Ramon y Cajal, who also has beautiful drawings of the connection. He was the first to affirm that the brain was dynamic and not fixed. So this is the first thing I wanted to say. The second one is that I also was interested in this plasticity because I'm a philosopher, and in the whole philosophical tradition, no one ever spoke about the brain. Philosophers talk about spirit, about the mind, about the soul, but nothing about the brain. The brain was just considered like an organ without any capacity, any symbolic capacity, no role in our identity. It was a kind of secondary organ. So I discovered, thanks to the neurological discoveries about plasticity, that on the contrary, the brain was the central organ, maybe, of our personality. And as you know now, about life and death, we declare someone dead when the brain is dead. So the brain has become really the center of our life and identity.
Mm-hmm. In your book, in the brain book, so you talk about the connection between neuroscience and politics. And you said that the brain mirrors capitalistic society. In what way?
So this was after I read Foucault, Michel Foucault, you know, the French philosopher, and also the French sociologist Luc Boltanski, who said that every epoch of capitalism borrows a model from the science of nature. The sciences of nature are also mechanics or thermodynamics. So, for example, in the Fordian capitalism, the model was hierarchical. So there was the head of, let's say, the system, and then a hierarchy, a pyramidal hierarchy. This model was borrowed from physics, from the machine, mechanism, etc. And now Foucault and Boltanski say that capitalism today defines itself as something flexible when there's no center anymore, no apparent hierarchy anymore, but they say, for example, a business is structured as a brain with multiple connections, multiple knots, and no centrality. So I was very interested in the fact that, in fact, capitalism had stolen much quicker than philosophers this metaphor of plasticity in order to designate the new mode of capitalist exploitation. But what they did is that instead of calling it plastic, they called it flexible. So they substituted flexibility for plasticity, because it helped them to say, if you want to work with us, you have to be flexible. That is, you have to accept everything, to bend yourself in all directions, all possible directions. You have to be mobile, you have to travel, etc., etc. And this is, this is also why I wrote What Should We Do With Our Brain? To make a strict distinction between plasticity and flexibility.
And elasticity too.
And elasticity, all three terms, flexibility, elasticity, and plasticity, comes from the physics of material. So a flexible material can be bent in all form, and it does not lose anything from this bending. Elastic, same thing. Well, it can lose its strength, but it comes back to its origin. Plastic of course means supple. You can deform something plastic, but once it has been deformed, it never comes back to its original form. For example, the sculpture, once the marble is sculpted, it never comes back to the original form. So it means that in plasticity you have a notion of resistance. We are supple, we are deformable, but up to a certain limit. And this is precisely what capitalism has occulted in their definition of flexibility. So it seemed important for me to to put things back in their place and say, okay, maybe capitalism today functions as a brain, but the big difference is that our brain is plastic, not flexible.
Yes. We can. It's very easy to see how what you call old metaphors about the brain are still in use. I think of it in psychiatry very often when people get so-called electroconvulsive treatment, so-called ECT. It's very often it's accompanied by a metaphor that it's like restarting a computer. Or for that example, when in the 80s it was like the brain is like, you know, the old TV sets when they were broke, you sort of banged on them and then sort of it's restarting an old TV set. So it's still around us, this non-flexible, the brain as a central instance.
Oh yes, and well, the computer, but also, for example, the French philosopher Bergson, he compared the brain with, before in the hotels you have receptionists that were transmitting the phone calls. See what I mean? They were. It says yes, the brain is a telephone central. It just transmits the information, doesn't keep it, doesn't form it. So yes, you have this metaphor of the brain as a machine. But, I mean, there are two ways of developing it. One is negative, as you said, like the brain is like a machine, means it's just a mechanic. But there's another one that is much more interesting. Is that, for example, now some computers, they use what is called synaptic chips. Okay. So now, for example, at IBM, they developed a new form, a new kind of chips that functions as a brain, capable of modulating its intensity, etc. So the metaphor of the machine can also be very interesting. Because some computers today are said to be plastic, precisely because they can change and their intensity, their tasks, etc. They are used, for example, in artificial intelligence. So the metaphor of the machine has to be taken with... it can be totally wrong, it can also be very interesting. Because the computers of tomorrow will be much closer to the brain than to the old...
the telephone exchange. Yes. Perhaps another question, but you mean that there's a shift in paradigms between genetic and epigenetic? Can you say something about that? So,
yes, it is of course very important. It was at the same time when neurobiologists discovered that the brain was plastic. It was at the same time when geneticists discovered that the DNA and the genetic code was not the only law of our being, but that there were also epigenetic mechanisms. So very briefly and not too technically, there's the DNA, and there's the interpretation of the DNA, and the result of this interpretation is the phenotype. So the genotype, the DNA, phenotype is you and is each of us. And in between the DNA and every individual, there's a lot of transcriptions and translations. These are made possible by epigenetic mechanisms. Epigenetic mechanisms interpret the code. And what the geneticists discovered is that in this process of translation, of course, these processes are made out of chemical and physical processes, but also they are influenced by the environment. Which, for example, explains that if you divide two twins, if they are educated in two different families, they don't look like each other anymore. So it means that the environment, education, habits, influences of all kinds have a great power on our identity. That the genetic is not the only key to our individual, but also these epigenetic processes. And epigenetics has become, of course, a field in biology that is as influential as genetics today. And for a great part, our brain has an epigenetic development, meaning that the brain can develop all along our lives and not only in utero. So the development of the brain is open during the whole life because it is epigenetically constituted.
A lot of people make genetic tests nowadays.
So this was, yes, what I discovered. I was totally sad and despaired about that because I thought, I've been working on plasticity, epigenetics, etc. for 15 years now, and I thought, this is the end of innatism, rigidly deterministic genetics, etc. And in fact, I didn't understand immediately, but once, I was opening my computer and I saw on Facebook one of these advertisements for My Heritage. This is something you can ask your DNA and know where you come from. So you take the little thing and you put it in your mouth, you send it to the post, and then you get an answer saying your ancestry is this or that. You are white European, etc., etc. In the beginning, and more people are taking these tests. It costs about $60 or $100. It's not very expensive, and more people.
An epigenetic test would be expensive.
Yeah, but it could not be possible. And I was really puzzled by that when I read an article in the Guardian by a Jewish girl who said, my parents took this test and they were very happy to discover that the test told them that they were Jewish, 100% Jewish. And she developed this and said that in the Orthodox community in Israel, you are encouraged to take these tests in order to determine whether you're an authentic Jew or not. And in Australia, there are some far-right parties. It's not about Jewishness, it's also about all kinds of identities. So for example, far-right parties in Australia say, okay, if you are a true Aboriginal, you have to take this test in order to prove that you are, so they can measure the social aid thanks to this test. If you are only 40%, you don't get the. So it's very dangerous. And a lot of people are doing this, and of course, it is. I'm starting reading about that, so it's not entirely wrong. It's true that the test can tell you something about where you come from, but it certainly doesn't tell you who you are. And I think people make this confusion, negating all the cultural epigenetic development. The person you become, all your life. So I think that unfortunately all this genetic determinism is coming back. And I think this is very worrying, at least for me.
Yes. In what should we do with our brain? You have a sort of stylistic trope that is called the epiphore, that many sentences ends with the same line, like the brain is a work, but we don't know it. Humans, my glasses. Humans make history, but we don't know it. We are our synapses, but we don't know it. I wonder what the place for this, what is the status, the place for this we don't know it? What kind of,
It was a play because it was a play with Marx, who says somewhere that we are making our own history, but we don't know it.
Yes, yes.
So this is where it tries to wake up our consciousness, saying we're not precisely determined, we are the actors of our history. So it was more risky to say it about something natural. Everybody can understand when you say we are making our own history, okay, because history is cultural. It's much more difficult to understand that something which is natural, which is an organ, which is hidden because we don't have any feeling of it, we are responsible for it. This was much more difficult to explain.
Would you say that it's something unconscious, or is it more like an ignorance?
It's both. It's unconscious, or let's say non-conscious, because the brain is a very strange organ to the extent that we cannot feel it at all. We can only feel it when it's sick or impaired. You know, when we look at these terrible diseases like Alzheimer's, etc. Here you can see. I think the person can see something missing. Otherwise, out of pathologies, we don't feel our brain. It's not like the heart when we can hear the beats, etc. It's phenomenologically, as we say in philosophy, non-subjectivable. We also don't know to the extent that we've been used, as we said in the beginning, for a very long time, to this understanding of the brain as something rigid, that we were not responsible for, that was working without us in a certain sense. So it's both a kind of scientific unawareness and a non-consciousness.
I actually think that something has changed the last decade about the awareness, sort of. When I talk to psychologists today, they study a lot about the brain, and it's also in more sort of easy read exoteric books. You know, I mean, even myself, I got a present from my youngest son a few years ago that was "Träna din hjärna." That's a brain exercise, just an exercise for the brain. I don't know why he thought I needed that. But this sort of, what do you think about this more?
We should,
which in fact is something which is your subject in a way.
I think we should not forget what we said in the beginning, which is the capitalistic. So of course, I mean, as soon as of course they discovered that there was a market here, so you find a lot of books in stations, you know, etc., saying what become this or that by training your brain, or love is in the brain, attraction is in the brain, you know, all these things, which of course are not really reliable. Because I mean, to be responsible of our brains, of course, means that we have to exercise them, of course, okay. But it's not only that. For me, it means, once again, let's not confuse flexibility and plasticity, and find the point of resistance under which we are under threat. For example, let's be aware that many things we are watching, like information, fake news, post-truth, all that, let's be aware that we don't have to bear that we can refuse that, you know? Because it is a kind of drug for our brains. This is what I think. That many things are meant to intoxicate us, and physically, the brain. And in what sense? Because it prevents us from concentrating on something. I'm sure that you've all noticed that to focus on something has become more and more difficult. We're constantly distracted by information, news, emails. So this is a mode of distraction. This is preventing us from concentrating on the essential.
So the neuronal man's attempt to resist.
Yeah.
How do one do that?
I know.
I don't think anyone will.
I mean, I cannot answer like, say, just let's do this or that. It would be too simple. It would be great if we could do that, but it's impossible. But I think at least be aware of it. You know, it's a new mode of being critical with what we receive.
You say in your book that the self is anchored in the brain, that we are our synapses. On the other hand, if I understood you correct, you don't mean that the self actually is a substance. So what is the self?
So, yes, there's a book by a neurologist, Joseph Ledoux. He's American, I think, or Canadian, American. And he says the sentence, "You are your synapses," comes from him.
Yeah.
It was very provocative, because immediately philosophers said, "Oh, no, we are not our synapses, we are ourselves." As if there was a difference between personality, identity, and something merely organic, like the synapses. I think that "you are your synapses" is a dangerous sentence if we understand this as a pure reduction of the being to mechanism. If we understand that as we are just biological data, it can be dangerous. But if we think of plasticity precisely, if we understand, and this is what Ledoux says, that in fact the synapses are plastic and are culturally fashioned, etc., then there's no problem anymore. Because the brain is not a substance. It's a basis, it's an organic basis, of course, but fashioned through culture. So in that sense, it doesn't shock me.
No, me neither, actually.
It's not a substance. So what is the self? The self, I think, is nothing outside this interaction between the biological and the social. There's no something like metaphysical or transcendent or divine that would be the self cut out from the biological.
So the self, in a way, it's not a substance, but it's perhaps a relation between substances and the relation between substances and
yes, it's the relation.
Everything else.
Yeah. It's an interaction.
Yeah.
It's an interface.
In Ontology of the Accident, and perhaps more extensively in your book, The New Wounded, you discuss subjects with Alzheimer and stroke, but also people who change after different traumas, and you call them the new wounded. You argue that we often should consider them as subjects who has lost their old personality and has become another. And you seem to mean, I think, that these subjects are new in two senses. First, that they have lost their old self, and two, that there is a crack between emotion and logic, and that is new in that respect, that it defines this new society. In what way is it new? I mean, strokes and social trauma has always been around.
So, why did I write this book that came out just after What Should We Do With Our Brain? It's because in the brain book, I talked only about, let's say, positive plasticity, as I just defined, which is constructive, creative, the fashioning of our identity, education, etc. But, plasticity has another meaning, which is explosion, that we can hear in the plastic, P-L-A-S-T-I-C, the explosive material. Plasticity has also a destructive dimension. And this I hadn't talked about in the first book. And so it is clear that the brain is not only something that develops itself, forms itself, fashions itself in a creative way. It is also something that can get destroyed. But this destruction is a very strange destruction because it also creates a new form of identity out of this destruction. This is what I call destructive plasticity. This is why I wrote the book. I was very struck by someone in my family who got ill with Alzheimer's disease, and it struck me that she was not exactly the same person as the one she used to be. And I said, maybe her disease has fashioned a new person, very different from the previous one, and maybe someone new. So not entirely new, of course, because we could recognize the same person, but at the same time, for example, she was telling us some memories that were false, things that she had never lived. She was reinventing her past. I know she was my grandmother, so I told her, but no, why do you say that? It's not true, you know that. But she was not aware of that. And I discovered in the book that this phenomenon was called the neural imposture. That it was very frequent, that people suffering from brain trauma or impairment are refashioning their own past because they lost their let's say true memories. So I decided to inquire about that and write that book, like what happens when the brain is severely impaired and the person becomes someone else. Because it seems that psychoanalysis never said anything about that. You know, there's a line in Freud in which he says that the psyche never gets destroyed, that we never forget anything, for example. We repress, but we don't forget.
Absolutely.
I think it's not true. It's not, I mean, Alzheimer is, I mean, the memories are destroyed.
No, but he has this metaphor with the crystal, that the crystal never breaks. By coincidence, it has its cracks, so it falls apart in certain with a pattern, and also the Wunderblock metaphor, that it's always something there.
Yeah,
that's. He sort of underestimates the sheer destructive violence in certain events.
Yes, because I think he also considered the brain as not really interesting. As you know, he was a neurologist, just say, oh no, neurology.
Even though he actually tried to write the project. I had this. Yes. No, where is Ray?
And also, I mean, while you're looking for your question,
I have this personal question that I'm talking about. Yes, exactly. Well, at least in the beginning of my reading, it was for me quite surprising that you and also Damasio, I think, put an innerly bodily trauma like stroke or Alzheimer as at the same level as outer trauma.
I was. Yeah.
Which explain. How could that be? I mean, it is in sort of common sense way of looking at it. It's something else. It's something inner or outer. But you tell us about it.
If Freud denies the power of, if he denies the fact that we can forget, it is because for him, the trauma triggers something that already exists, as you said, with the crystal. But that's something external, like an accident, etc. I cannot really have psychic repercussions. It can have physical consequences, but not really psychic. Because everything psychic comes from within and our previous history, etc. What I find very interesting in people like Damasio or these new neurobiologists we're talking about is that identify a brain disease with precisely an accident, and they say that these brain impairments have no subjective preconditions. For example, Alzheimer's, at least what we know about it right now, does not depend upon your past or your personality. And this is, on the contrary, what psychoanalysts would say about trauma. If you develop that neurosis, it's because something in your history determined you to develop it. But Alzheimer, or even all kinds of brain injury, cannot, I mean, it happens contingently. It's pure contingence, it's pure hazard, I mean, pure chance. So that they say it is like having an accident, so that we cannot make any difference between getting hit by a car and getting hit by a neural disease. Because nothing can explain, you understand what I mean? It's like, I mean, you get out of your house and you have an accident. It's the same thing with the brain, and that's what is so frightening, because we have no signs. Or when we have them, it's too late.
No, I get the point, but it's for me it's very difficult to metabolize. But yeah.
It's this idea that it falls upon you.
Absolutely.
And also because then once you have it, there's no way in which you can go and see a doctor and talk about it, just like in psychoanalysis, when you can, through the cure, try to work it out. Brain patients cannot talk about because most of the time the language is impaired, and there's not much you can say about it. So it remains external.
But it becomes.
Or it becomes
The same thing. 6 minutes to go. Should we have a question from the audience?
Of course. I don't even know when we are supposed to.
1:15. Questions? Please.
Jag?
Ja.
As far as I know, but I'm a layman of course, most scholars agree with you about the brains.
Jag har en...
Ja, men jag har ingen... Jaha, sådana grejer. Okej.
Prova om det funkar.
1, 2, 4. Most scholars agree with you about the brain's capacity. This might be a bit above my level in comprehension in English. About the elasticity, plasticity, ability to expand and constantly evolve. But there will be a question soon. But some scholars also claim that you mentioned the areas in the brain, that at least is one box, one trait which is hardwired into
of course, yes,
the language.
Course, yeah.
What's your opinion on that?
No, of course there are some anatomical structures of the brain that are absolutely genetically determined and fixed, like the cortical area for language, etc. Of course. So the basic core, the basic anatomical core of the brain is of course determined genetically. But the way in which the interactions develop between these different regions along our lives is different between individuals. There are no two identical brains. If you look at the MRI,
Yes.
you look at the shape of your brain. If you compare it with mine, they don't look the same. So of course the regions are the same, and anatomically they are localized in certain way, of course. But then the interactions between the different regions creates, well, let's say, it's like having roots and then branches. So the roots are the same, but the branches take different directions according to the individuals. Or there's another metaphor we were talking about. Like in music, you have the core and you have the interpretation.
Another question, perhaps?
Yes?
Here we have one.
Yes, thank you for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I think it was very interesting that when you talked about that our personality is in our brain, and I wonder if there's been any. There must be so much resilience against this thought in society, and have you discovered any, like, is it taking place in society? Is it developing towards, okay, this is actually facts, or is it like the religion and the soul and the spirit, all these subjects that has for thousands of years been a part of this is our personality? How is there a change going on now in the point of view in society?
You mean a reaction? Yes, a lot of reaction. As I said, you have this return of the power of the DNA, genetic test, etc. But also that our brain is not very important. What is important is our intelligence. And so I don't know if you have seen, our IQ is lowering. Have you seen this? Now you have this new...
We read to it.
We read too little. We are becoming stupid because our intelligence is disappearing. And this is totally as if the brain had no... as if our intelligence was something totally mechanistic. And because we don't read enough, it disappears. But there's nothing we can do against that. It's like a species extinction. So you have a lot of gurus today who are crying, saying, "Oh, look how stupid we are becoming," etc., etc. So you have a lot of discourses. I could quote others, saying, "No, we are not plastic at all. We are totally determined by the external world, and there's nothing we can do." Also in ecology, you have some catastrophic discourses. "Oh, we are lost. Oh, it's the end," etc. And they never talk about the capacity we have to struggle and change things. Of course, you have a lot of reactions, and as you said, the religious ones. So it's something else. As you know, creative design. There's no evolution. Our brain doesn't have anything to do with our personalities, etc., etc. So a lot of reactions. That's why I think that, anyway, science is always political. It's impossible to separate them. As soon as you talk about the brain or even the DNA, it's political.
Let's make that the last word.
It was
here.
quick.